Okay.
Okay. Yep, we are recording.
All right. Well, Jed, Terry, thank you very much for those kind words. I appreciate it a ton, but there is no doubt that a project like this and the success of this project was due to a whole slew of people, and we'll talk about all those people beginning and end of this presentation. But very appreciative of everyone who has stepped up and helped me along on this journey. With that being said, I think, yeah, we'll dive right into it. This presentation fits somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. Switching up formats, it changes the timing a little bit, but we're going to work through that. I appreciate you all joining in remotely to view this. Of course, these are some odd times that we find ourselves in, and as much as I would have loved to be able to see you all in person and do this presentation in person, we're going to adapt the best we can. So with that, I'll jump right into this. Let's see if I can jump into it. Just 1 second. All right, so here we go. First, I just want to acknowledge all the different entities and organizations that are involved in this project, really at the overhead level. I'll address these all again at the end, but just want to start this presentation with recognizing how important the collaboration between all of these different organizations was in the success of this project. So as I'm sure most of you here know at this point, moose have been declining across the southern portion of their range. We've been seeing it here in New England, but this is happening across North America. We're beginning to see their distributions march northward, as we've heard of with a lot of different other northward species. So we're seeing graphs and figures like this in Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. Across the board, people are worried about moose. Moose are an iconic species. They're that image that you think of when you think of the boreal forest, and they have a soft spot in everyone's heart. So what's been going on? There's been a variety of research that's been done here in New England, and it's pretty well been decided this is a parasite-driven decline. So moose, like many woodland critters, live with a variety of different parasites. We don't treat them like we do our domestic animals. And so they go about their lives coping with and dealing with all these parasites in their own ways. What we've been finding, though, is that there are two parasites in particular that have can have population level impacts on moose, and that's winter tick and brainworm. So before I dive into the research that we've done, I kind of want to give a little bit of a background on these two parasites and just go through quickly their life cycles, because I feel like it helps to explain some of the issues that we've been observing. So we'll start with winter tick. Winter tick is a single host species. That's really important. So it lives its entire life on one animal. It quests here in the fall. As the larval stage gets on the moose or the animal, goes through several different life stage changes and ends up as a fully engorged adult in March and April. Now, this time period is really important. You're going to see this time period pop up multiple times throughout this presentation. So I want to take a moment to talk about it. In March and April, the adult females breed, and then they engorge to about the size of a tick. So hopefully you guys can all enjoy this image with your morning coffee. So an adult tick can consume conservatively 1 to 2 milliliters of blood. Some estimates have them consuming up to 4 milliliters of blood each. So they're taking a large blood meal, and this is happening all synchronized in that, again, that March to April time period. So we see the effects of winter ticks come in two different ways, the first of which being direct mortality. We see that direct mortality mostly in the calf age class. So I show this picture because it shows how you have an adult cow and a calf utilizing the landscape in a similar manner, i.e. picking up ticks in a similar manner, but the size difference is notable. So while both these animals are going to enter the winter with probably a similar tick load, that calf does not have the physical size requirements to make it through the winter to supply nutrition for itself as well as all of these ticks. And so we see direct mortality in that age class. We also see this, the effects of winter tick in productivity or reduced productivity. So while we're not seeing the mortality in the adult age class, they do still pay a price. They still have to, they're suffering from reduced nutrition due to these winter ticks, and that comes out in reduced productivity. less twinning rates, smaller or less yearling productivity rates, smaller neonates. So although these animals themselves haven't been recorded as dying, we are still seeing an impact. The other parasite of concern is this one here. I've been trying to pronounce it for years now and I still can't. So we're just going to call it brainworm. It's also known as moose sickness. This is the classic sign that you see, or the classic symptoms that you see of a moose running around in circles. I'm sure you've all seen it on Facebook or on TV, Northwood's Law if you watch it. It's common. It's a common type of mortality in moose in today's day and age. So the brainworm life cycle is fascinating and it's really complex. So I'm not going to do it justice, but we're going to try and give you a general rundown. So the primary host is the white-tailed deer. The white-tailed deer lives happily with this parasite, and we see little to, if any, mortality or clinical signs in white-tailed deer. The intermediate host is a slug or a snail, and this is really an important piece of the puzzle. So basically, the white-tailed deer consumes a snail incidentally. Within that snail is a larval stage of brainworm. That brainworm then goes through a couple different life stage changes, ends up in the meninges of the deer, where it lives happily and reproduces, and then it goes about its life cycle. Moose are physiologically similar enough to white-tailed deer that when they incidentally consume that intermediate host, it can go through a variety of its different life stage changes until it gets to the adult form. And this adult form is a literal worm that lives in the spinal cord and brain system of a moose. And when it gets to this form, it's not picking up on the same cues it gets from a white-tailed deer. And instead of finding its way happily to the meninges, or the folds in the brain, and going about its life stages, it wanders around more or less aimlessly looking for its home. And so because of that, we see direct mortality in moose. We see the classic ears back, trouble standing, confused look. And its brainworm is thought to be always fatal in moose. So moving into Vermont in particular. This graph here shows the population trajectory of moose in Vermont from about 2000 to 2018. So it's important to recognize this initial decline was done purposefully by the state through a well-regulated hunt in order to reduce moose densities to a level that was within not only their ecological, but their cultural carrying capacity. No one is denying that in the early 2000s, there was too many moose in the landscape. They were eating themselves out of house and home. So once the department reached their goal in about 2010, they began to switch their strategies from reducing a population to maintaining a population. And unfortunately, despite significant decreases in hunting permits year to year to year, we continue to see this deep decline in moose populations. And based on some research that was going on in neighboring states, we had a pretty good idea that it probably had something to do with parasites. So the state, in the best efforts of trying to manage moose with the most current science, initiated a research project. And when you're trying to manage a species, there's two really important questions, or two really important numbers. The first of which is being how many die, and the second is how many are born or recruited into the population. So the original objectives of this study were to determine cause and rates of mortality and then measure productivity rates. So these form the basis of my two chapters that we'll begin to talk about here. Where do you study moose in Vermont? If anyone here spent any time in the Northeast Kingdom, you know that this is the heart of moose country. Our study areas consisted more or less 50-50 of private and public ownership. Along that private ownership, we have large-scale forestry companies that are harvesting a lot of timber and creating a regenerating forest. So not only do we have ideal species, tree species that moose prefer, and that moose habitat, we also have a variety of age classes on the landscape. So capture methodology. This is one of the things that everyone always loves to hear about. It's really cool. I figured I'd talk about it before we got into each individual chapter because it applies to both. So we use a crew out of Nevada to come in and capture moose. It's the same crew that captures moose in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York. So I believe they've collared over 800 moose now in New England. They've really perfected this type of capture using a helicopter and a net gun. So they're not drugging these animals. During capture in our first year, we were fortunate enough to have Josh Bluen up in a helicopter taking pictures with his camera of the capture crew catching moose. So here you actually see a gentleman hanging out of the helicopter. This calf has recently been netted and the cow's trotting off. They net the animal, they jump out, you can see they hobble the animal up. They remove the net from the individual, they put a blindfold on, they begin to take a variety of samples. These samples include blood, which they take from the jugular vein, as well as live weight of the calves. This is really cool. We get actual weight of wild moose in January. They then release the animal and they take the hobbles off and the animal runs off. This whole process is done in under 15 minutes. So it's really impressive that this crew can handle animals so quickly, so efficiently, get a bunch of samples, put a radio collar on them, and send them off without drugging the individual and without it taking a ton of time. Again, we take a variety of samples. These include hair, tick counts, feces, winter ticks, then whole blood and serum. So these tick counts, I just want to talk about for a second. This is when we count the number of ticks along 4 10-centimeter transects on the shoulder and on the rump of an animal. And so this is for a total of 80 centimeters of transects where we've counted ticks. And this isn't necessarily a tick count as much as it is a tick index. And so the same methodology is used in all the New England states for all of moose capture, moose research, as well as moose harvest. And so by us building this large data set between the states, we can kind of start to get an idea of how things are working regionally. So we'll move into chapter 1 now. And chapter 1 is dealing with, again, that mortality question. How many animals are dying? So the effects of winter ticks and internal parasites on moose survival in Vermont. So I'm going to move through each of these objectives. I'm going to talk about the methods and results of each objective together, and then we'll kind of have a general discussion about each chapter at the end. So objective 1 was dealing with health assessment and capture. We've got all these animals on the ground. We've got all these samples from them. Let's figure out what's going on inside the animal. What is the general health of the herd doing? So we take blood samples, which we send out for a variety of blood tests. Some blood we're spinning for serum, which we send out for serum tests. Fecal parasitology, which turned out to be really important. Pregnancy tests, physical condition. All of these metrics that we're taking from these animals in order to get an idea of what's going on. So just to overall, we radio collared 127 animals, 37 of which were adult cows, 90 of which were calves of either sex. Mostly we saw about a 50-50 sex ratio as was to be expected with moose, except for in 2018 where we saw this really skewed sex ratio. So just kind of an interesting though. Calf body weights were 173 kilograms on average, or 382 pounds. Not a large difference between male and female calves, which was very interesting. We actually saw that spread in females to be much larger than that in males. As far as tick counts go, we saw about an average of 27 ticks per animal. Again, that's along 90 total centimeters of transects. But I wanted to highlight this point. In our adults, we saw about 20 ticks per individual, whereas in our calves, we were seeing almost 30 ticks per individual. And so remember earlier we were talking about how smaller calves start to have more issues with more ticks. And here we're seeing on average, our calves are having more ticks. And this probably has something to do more with calf behavior in the fall than anything. So a lot going on here. Don't even try to keep up with all of it. This is just the summary of parasitology, but I just want to highlight some of these major numbers here. More or less, what I want you to get out of this is that our internal parasite counts at capture from the fecal parasitology was high, specifically lungworm. 70% of our calves had lungworm. Just keep that in the back of your head as we continue to move through. Objective 2 is determining cause of mortality. So in order to determine cause of death, we use 2 different methods, the first of which being field necropsy. So an animal dies, we get an email and a text message, we respond as quickly as possible. Our protocol calls for 24 hours, sampling within 24 hours. We almost always sample within 16. Here we do a full field assessment starting with condition of the mortality site. We then we do tick counts, you take a bunch of metrics, and then we go tongue to tail and do a full necropsy. And here we're looking at every single organ, looking for any abnormal lesions, looking for any abnormalities in general. We then take a small sample of each organ and we send it off to pathology. And pathology now looks at these tissue samples at the cellular level. And here they're telling us what's happening inside that moose where we can't see. It's important for me to note here that in assigning final cause of death, we found that it was really difficult to assign each individual animal a specific one overarching cause of death. A lot of these animals had more than one thing going on. And so while our field assessment would say, yep, definitely a tick kill, no doubt about it, we'd send it off to pathology. It would come back with lesions associated with meningeal worm or high lungworm loads. And so we started to paint this picture that more was going on than just ticks. Ticks were killing moose, but there was also some other underlying parasites. And so we decided that we would allow each animal to fall into multiple bins. So a calf could be a tick kill as well as have lesions associated with meningeal worm. And you'll see how that plays out here in a bit. But what did we see? Overall survival. Now, adult survival I'm going to be reporting here as annual survival, whereas calf survival is winter survival. So annual adult survival, when it was all said and done at the end of a 3-year study, we found to be 87%. Now, 87% survival it's not so bad. That's kind of at the lower side of a stable population and the higher side of decreasing population. But this is where things really start to get interesting. Our winter survival for calves was under 50%. We saw 49% winter survival. This is winter survival because we're radio calling them in January, and they're all this mortality is being observed before their first birthday in mid-May. So that's why we're reporting on that time frame. This is very low. We have a predator-free system here, so to be observing over 50% mortality in that calf age class is worrisome. Now, while we're talking about cause of death, I think it's important to point out timing of death. Remember that slide that I showed with the winter ticks on it, and we saw the March and April time period is where all of those winter ticks are engorging to just a crazy side, taking up to 4 milliliters of blood each. Well, does anyone notice anything interesting about where the timing of death falls? Almost all of our deaths, our calf deaths, fall within the month of April, which is right either during or just after that large engorgement period. So keep that in mind. So final cause of death, again, a lot going on here. We'll just walk through some of these important pieces. Winter tick, 91% of our calves that died perished due to winter tick. 91%, that is substantial. Possibly even more interesting than that, though, is that 25% of our adult cows died of winter ticks. We're not supposed to be seeing direct mortality in that age class. Once you get to be an adult, you're supposed to be okay. So the fact that we're seeing 25% winter tick-caused mortality, and this is coming from both pathology and field necropsies, is concerning. Another really kind of eye-opening result of this study was that 33% of our calves had brainworm, or presence of brainworm, lesions associated with brainworm. Brainworm was somewhere between their spinal cord and their brain cavity. This is concerning. We should not be seeing, just to backtrack kind of on thinking about the life cycle of this calf. So this calf is dying in, let's call it April. So it's 11 months old. There's been snow on the ground for 4 months. So it hasn't been incidentally consuming snails or slugs during that. In the first month of its life, we can presume that it was most likely just on the mother's milk. So now you're down to 6 months that this animal has to contract P. tenuis or brainworm. And so this starts to tell a little bit about how much of that actual worm is on the landscape. And then lastly, again, the presence of lungworm at necropsy. 74% of our calves had it present. It's a lot. It's notable. Moving to our last objective of this chapter, this has to do with estimating survival probability for each age class. And so here we used a Kaplan-Meier known fates approach, and a lot going on here. Don't worry about keeping up with all of it, but just want to point out that we had temporal variables that affect all the animals, individual variables that affect each individual moose, of course, and then rasters, which we used to estimate the effects of habitat. But I really just want to point out these variables here because they become important and they're a little bit confusing. So engorgement period. Engorgement period was a variable that we used to describe the effects of the female engorgement period on these moose. So this graph was made by Drew and Samuel in 1989, where they took a couple calves and they purposefully infected them with winter ticks. So they knew how many winter ticks they had on them. They then, through the fall and into the winter and into the spring, recorded the percentage of each age class of tick present. So here, each measuring period equals 1, right? And so this bottom graph here, this bottom line shows us the percent of the tick load that's in the engorged female life stage. And we're using this specific life stage because we know that unengorged adult females don't take a lot of blood, males don't take a lot of blood, nymphs don't take a lot of blood, compared to the adult engorged period. Again, taking anywhere from 2 to 4 milliliters of blood each. So we ran a univariate model here. We took a bunch of single models, ran them through, and we took everything that was not significant, that was significant and not correlated, and created a final model set. And in this final model set, lo and behold, we see engorgement period coming out as really the driving factor. But there was also these other variables that were popping out. And so we started to kind of ask ourselves, why? What's the significance of roundworm? What's the significance of lungworm? And when we plotted this out, Terry was influential in creating this really, really cool graphic here, where this shows the impacts of all 4 variables in our top model and how they influence each other. So here on the x-axis, we have engorgement period. So this is the amount of the percent of a calf's tick load that is in the engorged life stage. So that's on our x-axis. Y-axis is weekly survival. Our top 2 categories here are the presence of roundworm, and the bottom 2 categories, you do not have roundworm. And then of course we have females, males, and lungworm level is associated with different symbols. So just to kind of point out the 2 drastic differences, if you are a male with roundworm and you have a very high lungworm level, during the peak engorgement period, your weekly survival rate is just above 50%. That's very, very, very low. Whereas if you're a female, you do not have roundworm, and you have a very low lungworm level, even during the peak of engorgement period, we're seeing the effects of those winter ticks only taking that weekly survival rate down to about 0.95. So you can see how winter ticks they're the driving factor here, but there are these other parasites that may be compounding the effects. Moving to the adult model, here we took a univariate approach as well. Again, that cumulative engorgement period comes out. Here we multiplied the ticks, the adults ticks at capture, multiplied it by the cumulative engorgement period. So this weighted the effects of ticks based on how many ticks that individual had. And again, you can see the more ticks that the individual has, as you move along in the cumulative engorgement period, the more impact that is going to have on the individual. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about all these things. I just threw a lot of information at you. Vermont calves. We have a very high calf mortality rate. We observed over 50% mortality. That is substantial. If this was a predator, if we had a predator-heavy system, this may not be so eye-opening. But we don't have any predators. We're barely hunting these animals as is, if at all. Yet we're seeing this amazingly high calf mortality. Over 90% of this calf mortality is attributed to winter ticks. That's substantial. I mean, that is, except for a few calves over a 3-year period, every single other calf died of winter ticks. But we believe that in this study, we were able to show that this increased parasitism likely compounds the effects of winter tick. So these 2 pictures come from the same animal. This is obviously a heavy tick load on this animal, but this shows the lung. And this shows a significant impact of lungworm. So the lung is supposed to be that bright pink, beautiful color, but these dark checkerboard-like patterns show a significant impact of lungworm. Now, my argument on this is that in a group of calves each year, in your average calves with average tick loads, you're going to have some that are going to live because they have the weight, they have the size requirements, maybe they didn't get as many ticks on them. You have some that are going to die, smaller animals, maybe they didn't get as much, of the adequate forage that year, and they had high tick load. But you have this group in the middle where they could go either way. They're hanging on a fray where, geez, if winter's 2 weeks shorter and green up comes a little bit earlier, they might be able to make it. But if winter's 2 weeks longer and green up is set back, they're not going to make it. And so my argument here is that these other internal parasites may be taking the place of swaying the mortality of these calves one way or the other. So winter ticks are killing these moose. No doubt about that. But are there some other factors underlying that could be reducing the overall nutrition of these moose and making them less effective at fighting off an ectoparasite? And then lastly, that increased brainworm recurrence. Again, I dove into this a bit while we were talking about this in the objective. It seems substantial to me that we had over 30% presence of brainworm in mortalities. This is higher than any other study that's been found in New England, and it starts to kind of beg the question of if we could wave away the ticks, if there's a magic wand and we could get rid of every single tick out there, would we still see some bit of elevated mortality due to this other parasite? Moving to the Vermont adults, our overall adult survival is low, and it's right on that line of a declining population or a stable population. And again, the increased impacts of ticks is substantial, but I'd also like to point out, if you look at both the winter ticks here and the meningeal worm as far as effects, we're seeing 56% of our adult moose dying of these two parasites. Two very small parasites that are caused by densities of either moose or white-tailed deer or a climate shifting northward. Over 56% of our adults are dying of these two parasites. And then lastly, again, that increased meningeal worm impact. This is a picture that I took in the town of Bloomfield. I'm not saying it's common to find brainworm animals, but we were finding them on the landscape and it was showing up in our study. And I believe that there's a higher meningeal worm impact within our study area than has been seen elsewhere. Putting this kind of in a New England context, again, kind of a hard graph to get a sense of right off the bat, but I'd just like to point out the trends. Just look at how these trend together. And my point of showing this is that this is not a Vermont problem. This is not a New Hampshire problem. It's not a Maine problem. This is a regional issue. Moose across New England are being afflicted by this. So this is right between chapter 1 and chapter 2. A lot of graphs going on. Figured I'd show you a picture of a moose. Take a sip of water, let you guys get kind of revitalized. Nice cute moose ears. Before we move into chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 deals with declining fecundity or declining reproduction of moose in Vermont. Moving into our first objective, estimating rates of pregnancy and factors that affect rates of pregnancy at capture. Now, there's a really important piece of this, and this is at capture. So we capture these moose, we get a pregnancy test from them, we send it out to a lab in Idaho. This pregnancy test is 99% accurate for non-pregnant cows, 93 to 95% accurate for pregnant cows. But as far as beginning to look into the factors that are affecting pregnancy rates, we ran into a bit of a hiccup because we only have information from this animal from the time of tagging or time of marking moving forward in time. So we don't know a lot about them previous to our studies. We had to make some assumptions. So here's a covariate table that we used. Again, not necessarily for you to read as much as it is just to see that for these annual covariates, we had to start thinking, beforehand. Okay, so if we don't have any information for our specific animal before capture, what do we know? And so we could go back and we could look at the weather conditions during the previous rut and, you know, the year during the previous rut and varying things. But for our individual covariates, we really only had body condition. So again, we used a univariate logistic regression model. Sorry, I should have said that in here. And from this, we saw that we had a pregnancy rate, or excuse me, this is the observed rates. We had a 67% pregnancy rate that we observed in our study. Now, that logistic regression model, this AIC table shows us the body condition was really the driving variable. So this black line that you see here represents the null model of the probability of pregnancy based on body condition, whereas body condition is the light gray graphic here. And so, yes, there was an effect. It wasn't substantial, but it makes sense that the larger you are as an animal or the healthier you are, that body condition score was assigned by the capture crew at capture, and the heavier you were, the higher your chance was of being pregnant. Moving into objective 2. So this is where we start to get into some of that more fieldwork oriented stuff that we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation. This is estimating fecundity rates and those factors that affect fecundity rates. So birth rates, how many calves are hitting the ground? So here, this is our intensive field monitoring. We're walking in on these adult cows 2 to 3 times weekly from May 1st to August 1st. We're using our GPS locations and fine scale telemetry to locate these animals, sneak in, get a visual of that cow, determine whether or not she has a calf with her, and get out without her picking up on us. So this is where this took a ton of resources, a ton of time, a lot of really hard field work. But at the end of the day, we're looking for presence or absence of neonates. Was there a neonate there? We then used the same covariate table that we talked about before, but here we used a generalized linear mixed effects logistic model. And this mixed effects model was used because we're resampling the same cows year after year. So we had to put a random effect in there. So just to summarize this birth rate chart here, 8% yearling pregnancy, or birth rate, I'm sorry, and then 64% adult birth rate. This is low. These are both very low. We didn't see any, we saw 1 occurrence of twinning. We saw 1 occurrence of yearling pregnancy, and our adult birth rate here is half or just a little bit less than half of what it was known to be back in the early 2000s. This is substantial. Again, moving into that mixed effects model, what did we see? We saw that age was the driving factor here. The older you are, the higher chance you have of giving birth. So here, these low numbers are yearling birth rates. We have then over 3 years old, over 4 years old, and unknown. So it's important to show that these age classes are representative of at least this old. So in 2017, we collared 30 cows. We don't know how old these cows are. We just know that they're adults. So they're at least yearlings. Moving forward into 2018, we can now make some assumptions based on that. So now we can assume that everyone, all these unknowns in 2017 are now at least 3 years old. And then in 2019, they're at least 4 years old. And so on with yearlings from 2018 to 2019. And then as animals died, we would take a tooth and send it out, get an age, and be able to backdate them into their appropriate bins. So this is as close to these age classes as we can get, but it's important to remember that there could be 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old moose in some of these older age classes. Birth dates, I just thought this was kind of cool. To be totally honest, our mean birth date was May 18th. 87% of all calves born during our study fell within 1 week of either side of this. So just think of that synchronized birthing that's happening in the woods during that 2-week period to fall within that ecological cycle. It's just, to me, it's fascinating. Moving to our last objective, so we know how many are pregnant, we know how many are giving birth. Well, now we got to figure out that next step, which is neonate survival. So here, again, back to those cow-calf walk-ins, we're doing this 2 to 3 times weekly, really intensive monitoring, but now we're looking for visuals of the adult cows and their calves. And we're looking for the presence and absence of neonates, and then as well as survival. So we're looking for these little buggers. Again, we're very fortunate to have Josh Bluen on this project, who's a phenomenal photographer and got some unbelievable pictures of moose. So we can thank him for these really close-ups of this in particular, I believe, is a calf moose taking its first steps ever. So you guys saw it here first. So now here we're using a nest survival model, specifically the Schaefer logistic exposure nest survival model. And we're doing this because our sampling intensity and sampling distribution was uneven, had the potential to be uneven. And this model also doesn't require an assumption about the exact date of nest failure. So while we were making, our best estimates of when these calves were dying, the exact calving date, exact death date could be off. At any rate, our covariate table here shows that there was, as well as these normal annual variables we've been talking about, there's also individual variables about that neonate in itself, like birth date, days since birth, distance traveled with cow, and so on. So we are looking at neonate survival to 60 days. So from when this little bugger turns into this little bugger. Anyone here tell which picture Josh took and which picture I took with my iPhone? At any rate, our neonate survival to 60 days, and again, 60 days is when we consider these calves to be pretty well, not necessarily self-sufficient as much as it is able to fend for themselves against most predators. We saw 67% survival rate. Moving into that AIC table, calf age was really the driving factor here. So every day that that calf gets older, it has a better chance of surviving to the next day. And when you multiply out this this survival rate here, this daily survival rate, we see an average of an estimated 65% neonate survival. Moving to the discussion about productivity now. Let's talk about it all. We got a lot going on. Productivity rates are low. In this picture at the bottom of your screen, you see a beautiful, healthy cow with 2 calves in Salt Lick, probably on the side of 105 in Ferdinand. We don't see this anymore. Just visually, if you're talking to people on the streets, you don't see twins. We're not seeing yearling pregnancy rates. The cows do not look this beautiful this time of year. This is due to increased parasitism. So normally with these vital rates that we're seeing shift, you would assume, if you didn't know anything about it, you would assume that this was due to poor habitat, poor nutrition. It is due to poor nutrition. But now instead of habitat being the driving factor behind nutrition, it's parasitism that's driving that nutrition down. And it's due to this. It's due to unbelievably high winter tick loads. These animals they cannot feed themselves, a calf, and all the ticks that are on them every single year. So we're seeing a species that should be an annual breeder turning over to a biannual breeder. We're seeing these overall rates be reduced because they just don't have enough to give. And summarizing those productivity estimates, body condition determined pregnancy, older cows produce more calves. Makes sense. All the literature says this exact same thing. But think about this here, where we know now that body condition is being reduced year to year to year because of winter ticks. So whereas your yearlings used to have a subset of yearlings that were going to give birth, there's a threshold for yearling pregnancy. Once they reach a certain age or a certain weight, they'll ovulate. Well, we're not seeing that. Instead, that's being bumped back a year. So now your first-time breeders are being bumped back to 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. So now this whole point about older cows producing more calves, this is based on an older cow being an experienced breeder. So you're knocking back the time that it takes for an animal to become an experienced breeder. And then you're potentially hurting these winter ticks are hurting their ability to recover enough the next year to be large enough size in order to ovulate, in order to get pregnant, and so on. And lastly, again, calf age is most predictive of survival. And this makes sense. As these calves get older, they get their feet under them, get their eyes and ears to them, they're able to fend for themselves a little bit better. So to wrap this up, I'm going to walk us through a little exercise here. This is something that Tony Starfield would call rapid prototyping. So we're going to take all the numbers that we've talked about here, and we're going to put them down on one screen and run through them all really quickly. We're going to start with 100 adult cows. As far as timing goes, let's say it's right about now. It's March, moving into April. These animals are thinking about giving birth. Let's fast forward to mid-May. All of our cows give birth. We're going to assign that birth rate. So we have 64 calves that are born. Great, that's awesome. But now let's fast forward through the summer. Things happen. Nature is nature. We apply that 60% neonate survival rate 60 days. We have 43 calves entering the winter. Mind you, I'm not taking into effect, the potential of things happening in the fall. I'm not taking into effect anything else. This is just strictly neonate survival to the winter. Unfortunately, we have to apply that survival rate, that winter calf survival rate. And so now we end up with 21 animals that survived their first birthday. This is low. This is pretty low. 21 calves to 100 adult calves, or 1-year-old moose. But I want to know about the reproductive potential of this population. So we know that our yearlings, we had one yearling in our study give birth, but the reality is our yearlings aren't giving birth like they used to. So we need to fast forward another year. So we have to apply that adult survival rate to this cohort here. Now we have 18 animals that survived their second birthday. But again, let's be real, half these animals we don't care about. There's plenty of bulls on the landscape. They're gonna do the same thing as half of these calves. So let's ditch them. Let's apply that 50-50% sex ratio. And now we have 9 females that are surviving to breeding age. Just to drive that home, we have 9% female recruitment to breeding age. It took us 100 cows, 2 years to produce 9 females that could breed at the age of 2. Again, rapid prototype, a lot of places you could punch holes in it, a lot of things going on, but this is what we're looking at. We are looking at all of our vital rates being decreased due to increased parasitism. With that, again, one last time, I'd like to thank everyone who was a part of this, all the different organizations that made this possible. The number of individuals who helped with this is substantial, and unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through each person one by one, but I'm very thankful for everyone that helped to make this possible. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Jake. As we said earlier, if you do have a question, please just put it in the chat, and then we'll call on you so that we don't have people talking over the top of each other. And don't be shy.
Is everybody able to hear that all right?
I think so.
I just started on a rant and didn't stop.
I just wanted to jump in quickly too. You may have seen my message, but I do wanted to quickly acknowledge Dr. Katie Geeter and Dr. Stephanie McKay. Katie, of course, is from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and Stephanie's from UVM Animal Sciences, both of which are serving on the committee. So thank you both for your contributions and for being with us today. And I would also like just extend a great thank you to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I know many of you on this presentation are with the department. We really appreciate that you initiated and launched this study, and it's been a real pleasure to work with you on this. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. I'll echo too that especially Cedric Alexander was key in just kind of setting everything up and running it.
Jake, maybe I'll ask a quick question while others might be thinking. I know you talk quite a bit about your different models and so forth, and for the benefit of those that may not do this kind of analysis, could you give just a quick little overview as to how the model selection process works?
Yeah, so let's see if I can.
I mean, just a general non-technical overview, but what do you essentially?
Yeah, so basically we throw a bunch of models into. Let's see if I can just pull one up and it'll help explain it a little bit better. So we have a bunch of varying models that go into in this particular. So for example, this was really the one of the larger models that we used, and this was that nest survival model. So we take our models, we send them into this logistic exposure model, and it comes out with an AIC table. So this weights, it shows how each variable is best describing the data. So we're using our observed data to see with these models how they best describe the trend that we observe. And it then gives us an AIC weight, which allows us to see how well it describes that model. And so usually you want to have one or two models that are describing the majority of that weight. And here, for example, calf age described 60% of the model was described, or of our data was described through calf age.
Right, so each model is basically representing a hypothesis, and you're collecting a bunch of data and then asking, like, for a given model, is age really driving what, in this case, like calf survival? Is, another variable really influential in driving that, and so forth. So you're creating a whole bunch of different possible explanations for a pattern in your data, and you're essentially just confronting the data in each model to figure out, like which variable or combinations of variables really describe that pattern in the data. And you summarize that here in this AIC table.
Exactly. Thank you. I see that Henry Jones had a question here about weather conditions. So late summer 2016 drought and snow in late October resulted in high calf survival. Productivity in 2017 in New Hampshire was the scene in Vermont. Was your weather similar? Yes. Yeah, it was. I wonder if I can bust out of here and fast forward back to the graph that shows survival. It was in that first year in 2017. Man, we thought that everything was going to be just dandy. We started this project, and our adult survival was great. Our calf survival was above epizootic levels, and we thought that we were looking at a different system than maybe what had been observed in these drastic mortality events in neighboring states. And looking back on it, it definitely had a lot to do with those weather conditions. And when you look at this regionally, you see that everyone did really well that year, including Vermont and New Hampshire. All right, and let's see, what are the management strategies that can help reduce mortality, such as limit parasite loads? Yes, that is a great question. It's one of the questions that we get a lot. Up until this point, I've often, when giving these talks, I go, yeah, and we'll send that off to the managers. Cedric, what do you have to say about that? But there's a few different ways that we can look at this. One of which is, we know that this is a moose density issue. Oh, sorry, I should switch these. This is a moose density issue. So we had a ton of moose. It allowed, because of moose grooming strategies, it allowed winter ticks populations to absolutely explode. And that's really what we're dealing with here, is kind of the fallout of that. So presumably, we have some understanding of what the lower thresholds are for moose densities at which winter ticks don't have this type of effect. So presumably you could reduce moose densities below that target threshold, maintain them there for a few years, and then moving forward, try to keep them at a lower threshold. And the idea would be that you wouldn't see these large fluctuations of winter tick driving mortalities. There's a few things that you really need to have a good understanding of with that, and that being local moose densities, moose estimates. And these are things that a lot of these different New England states are moving towards, and I know Vermont Fish and Wildlife has been moving towards that idea and kind of starting to experiment with that. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
Jake, you have a...
Oh, sorry, Terry?
I was just going to say, you have a question about, has your group communicated with any researchers in Canada to look at their trends with respect to parasitism and calf survival?
That's a great question. It's a great question, especially as we talk about this. we're at the southern portion of moose range. That's why we're starting to see these issues first with these fringe species. It's kind of a classic ecological system. Moving north into Canada, you would expect that longer winters, actually less moose densities, we would not see these issues as regularly. I know in Quebec, they just started a research project where they're surprised to find that they are observing these same trends. And so they're doing some little different things. They're actually trying to treat animals, which is, that could be just about an entire thesis presentation in and of itself. But the long and the short of it is we are seeing this system play out north of us. It's just that to what degree are we seeing the mortality rates? For example, in northern Maine, we're seeing very similar tick numbers, but we're not seeing the mortality. And the thought is that those animals are large enough to sustain, currently, those calves are large enough to sustain high tick loads. And so there may be some of that playing out in Canada, but again, we're watching this system kind of move northward. And then Katie had a really good point about looking to monitor health metrics along with density. That's a conversation that I just had someone in depth the other day. Yes, we need to know how many moose are on the landscape if we're going to go with management approaches to try and manage moose, to manage ticks. But we also need to know the general health of these individuals. How are they responding, and monitoring that through time.
Okay, very good. Jake, Katie has another question for you.
Right. So as far as literature goes, I can't say that I can think of a paper off the top of my head, but thinking it just as far as the moose's cycle, I would assume that it would not take a cow long. If we could hypothetically wave a magic wand, get rid of every single tick out there, she's going to have that year of recovery. But past that, if she's not having that continued impact of winter ticks, you've got to think that once her weight hits that ovulation point, she's going to begin ovulating again every year. And I would presume that if you could improve the health, aka reduce the ticks, that adult female moose would rebound very quickly.
Okay, this is your last chance for questions. Anybody else with a question? I'll just say, if you are typing here, what happens now is that we'll end this public meeting, and then Jake will meet with his committee on a different forum to actually do the defense. And people are writing here, Jake, to you, nice job. Many people have said, way to go. Well done.
I think there was a quick message from Lizzie. I'm not sure if you got to that, Jake.
I thought Lizzie was asking about the management strategies.
Yep, sorry. Okay, got it.
All right, well, thank you again for joining us. And as we said, we were recording this video, and we will somehow figure out how to post this someplace so that it can be viewed by others at a different time. Jake, you want to have any final words at all?
I think just a big thank you to everyone who was involved in this project. I mean, this was an immense amount of work, an immense amount of field work. The field aspect of this project, took years and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Again, the housing up at the Nulhegan, the hospitality of everyone in the Northeast Kingdom. It was a community effort to pull this off, and everyone that was working in the field, very appreciative of all of them, all of the work from the state, the different agencies. I mean, I could go on and on and on with all the people who really needed a ton of, respect for pulling this off. So thank you to everyone, my committee, UVM, advisors, everyone.
Okay, those are the last words.
All right.
Thanks very much for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you later.